Hello, everybody. One, two, three. Oh, okay. Well, I haven't really prepared this video. This is more of a off the top of my head discussion, exploration, really to kind of get the creative juices flowing for you to think about the following topic. Um, well, I'm going to talk about energy models and how we are thinking about consciousness in terms of energy models at the Qualia Research Institute in a way that I think is actually highly generative. Um, but before I go there, I actually want to talk briefly about UFOs and unidentified aerial phenomena. It's a topic that I used to not take very seriously for a number of reasons. The the reasons are many why you probably shouldn't take these very seriously, such as, hey, there is a base rate of people who are histrionic, right? Some people love to draw attention. They love to be at the center of the party, to have like something interesting happen to them. There are traceable human motivations for people to claim to experience very strange things. And also, there exists like hallucinations. Self-suggestion is really powerful. Measurements can be wrong. There's a lot of reasons why you may want to just, not trust people's accounts of UFOs. At the same time, there are quite a bit of really smart people who are taking a look at these. And I recently came across, well, somebody emailed me about this, and I really appreciate that lead. There is a new foundation called SOL, which actually gave a kind of like a launching conference at Stanford last year, organized in part by Gary Nolan, Stanford faculty, who recently actually has been analyzing quote unquote materials from other worlds, from maybe other civilizations. I'll explain a little bit more in a second. But watching those presentations, learning a little bit more about the history of these, it really does seem that there is very strange things going on in the skies. I was ticked off by the situation of the New Jersey drones. Some of you may know what I'm talking about. Very early on, I just thought somebody must be like playing games there. Some hobbyist must be, putting drones in the sky, and then people are freaking out, and then the police is sending a helicopter to see what's up, and then people are reporting the helicopter, and there's more drone reports, and the hysteria, multiplies or something like that. And for a few days, just my priors and my understanding of human nature, just made me think, okay, like this is an easily dismissible thing. However, it really does seem like something very weird is happening because, there's too many witnesses. Too many stories seem to actually be pointing in the same direction about the type of phenomenon that it is. We're talking about something that is probably car-sized in nature, moves in formations. It's only at a certain hours of the day. But the strangest thing is like they can hover for very, very long times. People in government, they say they don't know what they are, but it's not theirs, and it's not from a foreign adversary. I scraped a bunch of news about these from verified sources, and I was playing with Claude to try to figure out, okay, what conventional explanations may actually account for these. And fortunately or unfortunately for my epistemology, none of the conventional explanations seem to make sense, at least not to account for everything, including like the incursions into restricted space in military installations. But above all, the very strange phenomenology of it. There's people reporting orbs, essentially spheres of light, and they're moving super fast. Well, in the presentations that I saw, from the SOL Foundation, there's a particular researcher, Knuth, who was presenting some interesting analyses of the acceleration of these objects as measured by radar. It all seems to indicate that these things can move at up to 5,000 Gs, which would completely obliterate any, material and any kind of like craft that humans would design would not be able to endure those accelerations. And then what's even stranger is they don't make a sonic boom, and they can go from air to water without causing a splash. Well, there might be a lot of things going on here. But what I want to highlight is there are things that we don't understand. That seems to be the case. And I think it's really interesting to look at the psychology of things that we don't understand, right? Like, at least historically, traditionally, human culture usually kind of like takes a while to absorb and make sense of unexplained things, from updating on the shape of the Earth, to, like the fact that the sun is at the center of the solar system and we're orbiting it rather than the other way around. People are really attached to their priors, their perceptual filters. So it's not entirely surprising that even when there's nobody gating you from gaining access to some information about very strange things, that for some reason that doesn't mobilize, a civilization-wide effort to try to make sense of the strange phenomenon. Really, look at who ultimately tries to make sense of these things, and they tend to be, quirky nerds who pay attention to odd things, what's kind of anomalous in their experiences. And I mean, think of, for example, optics, right? Like when you were a kid and you saw like a hologram, like if you're stamp collecting and some of those are holograms, or some of the, Pokemon cards, trading cards have a hologram. It's kind of like, odd, isn't it? Like, it's almost kind of, there's an extra axis of space in here. What is going on? My sense is that most kids actually just make something up and they think they understand it, when they actually do not understand it. And to understand how a hologram works, you actually require at least some undergraduate courses in physics. The fuller explanation comes from, at least in my case, something I highly recommend, which is reading Feynman's lectures on physics, or watching his lectures on quantum electrodynamics, that finally articulates all of the odd things that light does with a more complete model that involves a path integral and the superposition of all possibilities at once, and then taking the square of the summed complex amplitude. And you see, if you don't have that sophisticated model, there's a lot of things in optics that just make no sense. And yet, people just carry on. They just, go shopping, go to the movies. It doesn't usually, for most people, startle them to the point of really, pursuing answers, looking for an explanation, looking for a model that actually fits the whole picture. And well, it turns out I'm actually kind of familiar with this. Why? Because this is absolutely the case with psychedelic states of consciousness. I mean, think about it. Like, such a large percentage of people who take, for example, high-dose DMT report, like being convinced in the moment that this is not a hallucination, that this is some kind of alien technology. There's a mind-to-mind transmission with other entities, completely bizarre, very strange content. And yet, people's typical reaction is, well, that was just a hallucination, and, they laugh it off. Well, I'll say, first off, I think if you take seriously something like DMT experiences, I think it's really important to be able to articulate why you take them seriously. And I have a lot of content on this. It's something I've been obsessed with for the last 10 years or something like that, really trying to make sense of what on earth is going on when you take DMT. And the answer is not simple. Even in the most conventional of explanations, it ends up looking something like, I'm not saying that it's quantum, but something along the lines of quantum electrodynamics, where the model actually requires quite a bit of fiddling and conceptual openness for you to get at something that has explanatory power and is not just, oh, you're laughing it off because it sounds ridiculous. Well, one very big mistake that people make when they talk about their deep psychedelic experiences, unfortunately, is they focus very much on the semantic content, which is actually the least impressive aspect of this, right? Why? Because semantic content can be produced in many different ways, and you can arrive at the same description, right? So if I say, hey, I went to a crazy cartoon land where there was a clown that had an ice cream cone, and then I transformed into the ice cream cone, and then I was torn apart in half, and then half of me was in some kind of strange fractal bushes, and the other half was like melting in the sun, and then the experience ended. I haven't really communicated much. Why? Because this could be a dream. This could be a salvia experience. This could be a DMT experience. It could be a ketamine experience, an iboga experience, hypnosis. Nothing that I said would actually narrow down what is the texture of the experience and the dynamics that actually point at useful scientific information about this phenomenon. So I, for the most part, don't pay attention to the semantic content. I mean, I think that it's fascinating. We do live by narratives and meaning, and that's very significant from a, personal perspective. But from a scientific perspective, it's the least interesting aspect of these experiences. Instead, I focus on the phenomenal character, the what is it like of the experience, in as much detail and precision as possible, grounded ideally in mathematical models. But then above that, the dynamics, right? Like, in what kind of thing is the field of consciousness such that it has these exotic configurations like a DMT trip? Well, if you want to make progress there, you need to actually characterize what is strange about a DMT experience. One of the first things that I would point out is hyperbolic geometry. Have a lot of things written about this. But yeah, on DMT, for example, you may enter a crazy palace, beautiful, spiritual. Sure, there might be angels or aliens. Again, I would say, honestly, kind of disregard the content. That's not what makes it interesting. And maybe the walls are tessellated with heptagons, 7-sided polygons. And yet they seem completely flattened without distortions. And it seems like very large walls. Okay, so hold on a second, this is impossible. It's impossible to tessellate a space with heptagons. At least not in Euclidean space. In Euclidean space, you can tessellate it with triangles, with squares, and hexagons, and that's it. At least if you only have one polygon, one shape of a polygon. But heptagons, you cannot, because the angles add up to more than 360 degrees. Meaning that if you actually experienced a crisp, undistorted, tessellation of heptagons, you were experiencing a hyperbolic perceptual space. Or at the very least, the fields of your consciousness were shaped in a way that would give rise to implicit hyperbolic geometry in terms of the subjective distances between the elements of the scene. Okay, so that already is very peculiar and fascinating. But there's like other things as well. There's a lot of optics phenomenon. Like things such as, if one of the things that you hallucinate is networks of crystals on DMT, one of the things that happens is that it can focus light, as it were. It's almost as if you're engaging either with, a sophisticated physics engine that is usually not activated, or you're actually tapping into physics in a sense. And I tend to actually suspect it's the latter, that, hey, consciousness is, the intrinsic side of the fields of physics is how I tend to make sense of reality these days. And the type of phenomena that happens on high-dose DMT has to do with kind of the high energy configurations of these fields of physics and the dynamics that gives rise to. So let me tell you a little bit more about this. So, in computer science, in machine learning, in physics broadly, there are what you call energy models. And I think that's actually a very promising way of studying any phenomenon at all, is just postulate that there are different levels of energy where different transformations can happen at those levels of energy, that there are energy sources and there are energy sinks. And it really does seem that from this perspective, you can assign kind of like a total level of energy to a moment of experience and reason about its properties from that point of view. In physics, that would be called the Hamiltonian, which is how do you add together the features of a physical system in order to come up with the final energy score of that system. The classic example being something like a pendulum, right? A pendulum idealized, with no air friction and in an idealized situation, has a constant amount of energy. The energy is just going from potential energy to kinetic energy and back, right? But the total energy is the same. In other words, the transformations that are happening within that system are taking place in a cross-section of its Hamiltonian, which is all of the possible configurations of the system for a given level of energy. Well, I think it makes actually a lot of sense to talk about consciousness in terms of levels of energy. Partly because, intuitively it makes sense, subjectively, when you're like very awake, if things feel very real, you say like, I'm very energized. When you feel, very depressed, very sleepy, it's like, oh, I'm low in energy. Well, okay, like let's take that description seriously and try to formalize it. One simple way of kind of like quantifying the total amount of energy of your consciousness would be something like kind of like breaking your experience into a series of pixels and then adding up the intensity of each of those pixels. And you get the total energy score of your moment of experience. Well, from that perspective, DMT dramatically increases the energy of your consciousness. I mean, to begin with, it has kind of this tracer effect. It takes kind of snapshots of what you just experienced, and it makes them flicker and linger on top of what you're experiencing. In a sense, this is already happening all the time. Like already, we always have a little bit of a tracer on our experience, and I think that's computationally significant. It's perhaps essential for the very notion of conscious memory that we have and the sense of the passage of time. We require a little bit of a tracer for what is it that you have been experiencing recently. Well, on DMT, the tracer flickers, alternates very fast between its color and the opposite. So if you have a blue ball moving around in your visual field, it will alternate between blue, yellow, blue, yellow, blue, yellow, and it will be doing it very fast at around like 30 hertz or so. It's something that we have measured with the QRI tracer tool. I'll put a link in the description. And as a function of the dose, the tracer will be longer. And also it will be flickering at a faster frequency. At high doses, everything is flickering super fast at lots of different frequencies, all of them pretty high. And they're all trying to interface with each other, interact with each other. Okay, so in that sense, that is a massive kind of like energy influx into the system. And then you have energy sinks. It's like the way in which the system is going to try to dissipate that energy. And the hypothesis here, the premise is that we evolved in such a way that our natural energy minimization process does computationally useful things that natural selection would be recruiting for, replication, causal effects, information processing purposes. And so the two main energy sinks to consider to make sense of these experiences are, first of all, semantic content. Whatever you have experienced before is something that the field can sort of like snap into. Whatever it's similar to something you've seen before, kind of you have that trace of a memory of how features are put together, that crystallizes the field a little bit around it. So if on DMT everything is kind of super wobbly, chaotic, and then you kind of stumble upon, oh, there's a dog. It may kind of like a shrink wrapper, like kind of like crystallize or wrap around that concept or object, something that you recognize. As a consequence, on DMT, the field is constantly kind of like coalescing and converging on things that you recognize. And then, of course, that it becomes recursive, because the moment, you crystallize into a dog, the dog will add context to the entirety of the scene, which changes the energy landscape for other things that you recognize. So things that are more related to dogs will be prioritized in your ability to recognize them and lower the energy of your field. As a consequence, you may end up in something that has a lot of other dogs, for example. Like a dog daycare. You may hallucinate a dog daycare or something along those lines. I wrote an article called Aligning DMT Entities that kind of explores a little bit more this process, compares it to, GPT, but in the realm of perception as opposed to in the realm of language, and predicting next tokens. Really, you're kind of like predicting parts of your field as a function of the information that is embedded in the rest of the field. And you're doing it in a massively parallel, multi-scale way, and it's very quickly converges on things that you can recognize or make sense of. It's actually for that reason that the content of DMT experiences to me is not as significant, because that is more related to what you know and what you have experienced, kind of like the high level energy sinks that you use to make sense of the world, to not be surprised all the time. And yeah, I mean, because this is such a strange experience, it doesn't surprise me that people converge on, mystical things like angels and aliens and, things that are like at the edge of our sense of possibility. We're like, well, everything else has failed, so it must be this. I interpret it personally just as a semantic energy sink, and I think it's much more fruitful if we analyze it that way than if we, just right away kind of like take it at face value. What we should take at face value is not that. I'll explain what is it, and it's much more interesting than that. And then the other very important energy sink is symmetric configurations. Effectively, I've cataloged these very extensively. You can see it in my Harvard talk on the hyperbolic geometry of DMT experiences, a bunch of my write-ups. How, DMT has different symmetrical patterns as a function of the dose, where in smaller doses, you get like these two-dimensional symmetry groups, which are like all the ways you can tessellate a two-dimensional surface with polygons. What you see behind, those are the 17 wallpaper symmetry groups. We even have like t-shirts with them. They're pretty cool. But essentially the visual field, if you look at a wall that has a stochastic texture, it may converge into any one of those 17 symmetry groups. At a slightly higher dose, that gets to, those like hexagonal or heptagonal tessellations, which is hyperbolic in nature, where the angles add up to more than 360 degrees. If you take a higher doses, then you start going into the realm of three-dimensional symmetries. What is called the space groups is all of the ways in which you can essentially tessellate space, and there's a whole bunch of them, around like 230. But it doesn't end there. Like, that is still essentially the upper ranges of the magic eye level. But the moment you get to waiting room, which is the fourth level, and especially breakthrough, you actually are able to experience three-dimensional hyperbolic geometry, where, for example, you may experience space itself being tiled with dodecahedra. And things like that, things that are, definitively impossible in Euclidean space. Now, again, please don't jump to conclusions. I'm not saying that you're entering a literal hyperbolic space outside of your mind or anything like that. My default assumption is that these are configurations of the field of consciousness within your own topological pocket generated by your nervous system. But they are the high energy configurations of that field, which may have like very different, geometric and topological properties. Okay, so you can catalog that. You can actually, use these energy models to, in a sense, analyze what happens on a DMT experience in terms of how the energy sources interact with the energy sinks and how the experience ends up being stitched together by combining things that you have recognized before and symmetries, which are physically just natural energy sinks. All of that, actually, I figure it out on my own just by thinking very deeply about this and really caring about the phenomenon. But it's, in some sense, just the basics. I mean, DMT turns out to be way more challenging to our conceptions of how consciousness works than just this. And I'll give you a couple reasons why. Again, I don't personally focus at all on the semantic content. You could tell me you saw an angel and he told you that, Jesus went to Tibet and learned Buddhism, some complex weaving narrative. I will most likely just make sense of it in terms of your own personal conceptual energy sinks and how you were stitching together that high energy configuration of consciousness. So it's not going to surprise me much, but there are things that you can tell me that will absolutely draw my attention. And I'll mention like three from very credible, very credible sources. And some of these have been reported by more than one person. So this has to do with DMT analyzed from the point of view of qualia computing, computation using consciousness, where the computation is really powerful, and it doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that us humans are particularly good at, and it seems to be tapping into some physical algorithmic process that actually speeds up computation very significantly. The first one is color, essentially is related to the four-color theorem. So, if you have a map, let's say, of a bunch of countries, and if you start painting those countries, it's difficult, but it is always possible to paint them in such a way that no two neighbors are painted with the same color. So this is called the four-color theorem, which applies to some manifolds, the typical ones that we would encounter. Doesn't apply to, for example, like two donuts, put together, or a pretzel. Actually the numbers are different for that type of object. But the point is that for any given surface, there's a mathematical guarantee for what is the minimum number of colors that you need in order to paint them in such a way that you don't have neighboring surfaces or regions that are of the same color. Well, so on DMT, this can happen in extraordinary ways. I mean, like, you can enter, again, like these very complex hyperbolic surfaces, really intricate, maybe in some cases higher dimensional. And again, you may, kind of just dismiss when I say higher dimensional, because, well, what does this guy know about higher dimensions? But no, seriously, we can probably even formalize in what sense this phenomenology is higher dimensional, including the existence of four-dimensional rotations, for which we actually have a tool you can play with to get an intuition for what I'm talking about. But, these very complex, these shapes, these configurations you have never seen before. And then you may have the phenomenology, excuse me, of quote-unquote contacting a type of intelligence who just loves to paint surfaces. And if you get quote-unquote in touch with that type of intelligence, or hallucination or self-organizing principle, whatever it ends up turning out to be, right away, it will just paint everything perfectly. And there's going to be no neighboring regions that are of the same color. And this is not done naively. It's not done in a sequential fashion. It seems to be done in a way that is kind of like simultaneously aware of the low-level constraints, the local constraints, and the global shape. And it happens extremely fast. I mean, within the span of a second or less. And on top of that, it can be done again and again and on top of itself and iterated over. Kind of like, if this is in some sense an intelligence, showing some kind of interesting demonstration, it's able to do it a bunch of times in a row, and really in a way that is really compelling. Now, I'm absolutely not jumping in any way to the conclusion that this is an external intelligence to you, but I do think this indicates, to the extent that these reports are credible, that you can actually tap into these exotic self-organizing principles that provide very unusual computational advantages that actually, does hint at what kind of substrate consciousness must be running on. Okay, the second type of kind of like intelligence or like strange intelligent-like behavior that happens on high-dose DMT has to do with kind of what we've been calling projective intelligence and compactifications. So projective intelligence, I have a video about this, one of the most recent ones, where I talk about how a lot of, what I think our conscious mind is doing is finding mappings between fields of different dimensions in order to compute things with those. This is, by the way, something machine learning is currently studying and in some sense discovering. But I think, this is actually essential to how we process information. To a first approximation, the visual field is two-dimensional. The somatic field is three-dimensional. Every visual sensation in your visual field is implemented with tiny kind of like muscular contractions that keep track of the embodied sense of distances. I've talked to Roger Thiesdale and Winston Bryan Scott, people who are like, very attained meditators. And they confirm that in very advanced meditation stages, essentially, the field becomes much more harmonized, the visual field with the somatic field, and the resting state is actually just two-dimensional. And like, for you to fabricate any sense of depth, you require a little bit of tension. And so actually inhabiting a 3D world comes with an inherent sense of a little bit of attention, actually. In our normal everyday life, we're doing these back and forth between three-dimensional representations, two-dimensional representations, and waves that live in either of those two representations. And we're trying to align them in order to minimize out-of-phase interactions. Here's one of the things that you can do with this type of computation, which is analyzing an object by spinning it in space and finding a projection to your visual field that highlights a particular symmetry. An example of this is, looking at a cube. If you have a cube and you can rotate it, you can put it right in front of you, and then it forms a square. Okay, so the cube is more than a square, right? Like the cube is a three-dimensional object, but the square is a two-dimensional object that is symmetric in two dimensions, right? It has like rotational symmetry, reflection symmetry in two dimensions, meaning that those symmetries are also in the object that you're projecting, but along only one axis, right? And then you can rotate the cube again and project it differently, and then find another square, and then another square. And in that way, you can characterize the symmetries of the three-dimensional object by looking at the symmetries of the projection. Now, the visual field, being a two-dimensional surface, has two-dimensional resonant modes, and so it is very easy for it, again, from an energy model perspective, to find the inherent symmetries via a process of stochastic resonance, essentially amplifying the resonances that are natural in that space. In other words, it's kind of like you have this cavity with many possible resonant modes, but all of them are two-dimensional in nature. And so if you have a three-dimensional object that you projected into it, naturally and very easily, cheaply, in a massively parallel way, you can find the two-dimensional symmetries of that three-dimensional object. Okay, I think that we are constantly doing that whenever we are mapping out a space, we're reading a map, we are deciding how we're going to get to work, or even how we're going to send a basketball to somebody else. We are making projective transformations, mappings between 3D and 2D, keeping track of the symmetries in 2D, remapping them to 3D, modifying them in 3D, reprojecting constantly. We're constantly doing that. And that is a little bit stressful. How efficiently you do it probably has a lot to do with your kinesthetic intelligence. And even the fluidity of thought might have something to do with the efficiency with which you do this process. It's already very sophisticated in a normal everyday state of consciousness, but high-dose DMT, it can be so much more sophisticated. We're talking about, I'll just give you one example of what can happen here is there is a type of superintelligence on DMT, recognizable in the sense of, if you are quote-unquote contacting, merging with, or becoming one with that type of intelligence, it's sort of like you have a profound intuitive understanding of how to do these projective transformations for information processing purposes. And one of the things that becomes accessible is to be able to take entire streams of qualia, kind of like a life's story, for example, and somehow, don't ask me how, kind of like reproject it in such a way that it becomes a tube, a very thin tube, and then the tube can get painted with color in such a way that the information content inside that cube is completely fully captured by the paint on the surface. It's kind of like holographically painted in such a way that yeah, it's kind of like by peering into that tube, you can see the entire stream of sensations, but then it can be abstracted away by looking at it at a distance. And then what you can actually do is compare a bunch of these tubes together and do kind of very quick operations by shifting the colors around and making comparisons. And, in a matter of like seconds, maybe a minute, arrive at very sophisticated judgments of similarities and differences and isomorphisms and commonalities between, let's say, the life stories of completely two different characters, in a way that is self-evident. And once you find those resonances, you can recover them by refolding or unfolding this tube back into its live stream. Okay, so what is going on there? That, sure, you can say it's a hallucination, no problem. But is it like trivial from an information processing perspective? I don't think so. I think this probably contains, at the very least, powerful hints for how to advance machine learning in completely novel directions. But I think it's more profound than that. I think it's actually hinting at how to generalize this projective intelligence that is already naturally available to us to higher dimensions and alternative geometries. I don't know what we can do with this yet, right? But to me, it's obvious if you're smart and paying attention, this should be a highlight. It should be, okay, oh gosh, like as a humanity, as a civilization, we do not understand this. This is a little bit of, paradigm shifting or framework challenging, feature of reality that ought to be studied if we're curious about consciousness and reality. The third one that I will mention is the finding of topological extrema. This also strongly suggests energy models. So the metaphor here is with a pair, effectively. So if you have a pair, like one of those pairs that have kind of like a neck, and you take a string, and you make a loop with that string, and then you slowly try to kind of like shrink that string, is going to find a bottleneck where that distance, the amount of string on the pair is minimized. Okay, so that is a topological extrema, right? It's kind of like a shortest path embedded in that shape. Finding this is computationally challenging. I mean, if all I give you is a mesh of that pair, I mean, there are algorithms to do it, but many of them, for example, use spectral graph theory and a lot of things that are, massively parallel in nature, and can actually find this extrema, but it's not obvious right away, right? It's something for which you need to do some significant work. Well, DMT states of consciousness seem to be able to do this automatically and as just kind of like a feature of that state for very complex higher dimensional shapes where, there might be this very crazy surface or field of awareness that is twisted in a certain way, but right away you find the shortest paths within them. And there might be multiple, they might be orthogonal to each other, moving in different directions, and they weave together, could be a very exotic topology. I mean, that's actually one of the highlights of breakthrough DMT experience, tends to be changes to the topology of your field of experience, where it stops feeling like, hey, you're just kind of like looking at a volume from a certain perspective, and it's more like, no, you are kind of like a Mobius strip or, a Klein bottle, but a higher dimensional version of it. And it may manifest in ways such as, for example, connecting your embodied sense of your toe to your forehead. And then you're kind of like you're embodying a cartwheel. I mean, it's not necessarily pleasant, it's very strange, but it is very exotic, right? It's a very exotic configuration of the field of consciousness. And what's fascinating, and, from sources that I trust, who I think have the technical expertise to be able to evaluate this phenomenon, indeed, right away, the state highlights all of those minima, all of those geodesics. Again, this to me suggests an energy model. It suggests something that uses path integrals, that is like exploring all possibilities at once and putting them in superposition. It's suggesting a certain type of computational medium that to me, puts in relief nonlinear optics as a strong kind of like broad candidate for the possible physical substrate of how conscious experience is implemented. And there's so much more. I mean, there's also, more super intelligences that exist, quote unquote, on DMT's states of consciousness. There seem to be, things that are kind of these geometry beings, higher dimensional hyperbolic geometry beings, where, to give you kind of like a flavor of what we're talking about, like imagine a Christmas tree where there's a lot of adornments, right? And all of those adornments is reflecting all of the other ones. So all of them have a tiny model of the rest. And usually they're organized in a very crisp hierarchical way with a star at the top. Okay, so maybe that is kind of like our normal mind, where we have like a model at the top, which is kind of our sense of self, that is keeping a snapshot of the state of the entire system. But every part of the system also has a model of, at the very least, the other parts it's interacting with in order to minimize prediction errors, cut down on the entropy cost and the heat that this computational system might be generating. And it's kind of like finely tuned for like normal everyday tasks. Well, on the DMT state of consciousness, you could imagine now there's 20 of these like stars, and they're all competing for being the center, in a sense. 5-MeO DMT is different in that there is no central star. There's no center, and there's no kind of like competition for being the center, or everywhere is the center. DMT, not really. I mean, DMT has a lot of egos, as it were. It has a lot of centers. But then collectively, they can coalesce into something that seems like capable of computations of a higher order than what we are normally capable of. And when you have something like this, I've been calling them not only Indra's net, which is, this concept of everything reflecting everything else. It's more like Indra's hypercomputer neural net, where like it is also a supercomputer. And it is able to understand itself and model itself as a whole. And so there's a model of how everything is put together, but also every part of it is keeping track of specific information. That whole system may process something like a trauma. I mean, that sounds, completely ridiculous. Like using this massive, supercomputer to process something like that you felt left out in elementary school because they bullied you or something like that. I mean, sometimes that happens. Sometimes one of these things is what helps you process that sort of information. But it could be something entirely different, right? It could be like trying to make sense of an equation, for example, or trying to make sense of the concept of time using these sort of computational architectures. But what's really stunning is, in some sense, like the agentivity, just like how agentic and coordinated these kind of hive minds can be. They can, for example, turn into a temple. They can kind of like see each other and coordinate. And like when you're in a circle of people and you're, let's say, like everybody's like holding hands, but you're in a strange contorted position, and you say, okay, at the count of 3, we will all expand our hands, our arms, and everybody does it at the same time in a coordinated fashion. And if you see it from above, you see how these like weird mesh of people kind of like organizes into just a perfect circle. They can do things like that, where like they kind of like are measuring each other's position and configuration, how they are put together, and then they realize an opportunity. It's like, wow, we could actually turn ourselves into this beautiful temple full of rainbows, and it looks like a classic, Jainist architecture or something like that. In the count of 3, tun, 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 and the whole thing self-organizes into this temple that is coherent across all scales, fractally. And it seems to be intelligent and seems to be able to have, deep existential conversations with you. I don't know what is going on, right? It's very puzzling. And again, the basic, the default assumption that I work with is, well, the brain is some kind of optical supercomputer. And these are some of the exotic configurations of it. I am open to other possibilities too. I'm not closed off. But the one thing that I find in some sense epistemologically unacceptable is to just pretend that there's nothing weird about this. Like, you've got to be crazy to have that opinion that, hey, there's nothing interesting here. Oh, the neuroscience already understands this. You're just weakening the priors. You're just finding the resonant modes in the cortex. No, not at all. There's something way more interesting happening here. And again, I've been at this for like a decade, and there's some people absolutely that are joining in this quest to make sense of it. But what percentage of the population? Like, minuscule, right? Like, most people don't approach this with a level of rigor or intellectual caliber or determination to make any meaningful progress at all. Mapping this onto something like, what on earth are these, UFOs that can move at 5,000 Gs? Well, again, it doesn't surprise me now that there isn't really that many people who have the intellectual caliber to actually make meaningful progress on this question. If it's not related to, defense or making money, it doesn't seem like as a civilization we tend to prioritize it. But we'll see. We hope to change that. Anyway, just some thoughts on the matter. Energy models. There's one last thing I wanted to communicate about energy models, and that is, this is a deep rabbit hole, but energy, there's also the sense of identifying invariants. So, meditative energy, jhana energy, in the high concentration states of consciousness that you can access via meditation. Why call that energy as opposed to something like activation? Well, because if you're actually experiencing these very beautiful, harmonious traveling waves, you will notice that one of their features is that they don't change in their shape as they move around. And that actually connects with physical energy. That, the thing that makes physical energy what it is the symmetries of space and time, the symmetries of physics. The fact that there is symmetry over space or time is the reason why there is preservation of momentum, preservation of energy. So in the same way, this connects to the symmetry theory of valence, it connects to neural annealing. If you can set up your system in such a way that, the cardiovascular system, the peripheral nerves, maybe the lymphatic system, all of these other kind of auxiliary components of your being, if they are resonating in phase in the right way, and they're instantiating a field-like behavior, it actually makes quite a lot of sense to talk about this in terms of energy, because you're talking about in what way you have invariant shapes that don't distort as they travel. And that does seem to be a general pattern that as you advance further in the jhanas, in concentration, you're tapping into new invariants. You're tapping into new ways of homogenizing your field of experience in such a way that patterns can multiply and survive across space and time within your pocket of experience. I'll just give you one more interesting kind of pointer, which is, angular momentum. When you have a planet orbiting a star, the reason also angular momentum is preserved is because of the rotational symmetry of that system. So this actually applies to jhanas, applies to meditation states as well, because you can either homogenize your field in such a way that you have, let's say, Euclidean symmetries, where the patterns repeat, in a way that is translationally symmetrical, but also you can enter into these more circular jhanas, where there's a point at the center, and everything is the same as you go away from that point. And if you can actually make it perfectly rotationally symmetric, that also that also activates kind of this invariant and quote unquote free, with no dissipation movement of waves in a rotational way. And okay, the more complex things, I think like this definitely happens on higher doses of DMT, is that there might be patches where you have Euclidean symmetries, patches where you have hyperbolic symmetries, spherical geometries, and in what way the waves can travel without dissipating and without changing shapes depends on the symmetries of the patches of the field of consciousness that you're examining. So to a large extent, actually, a lot of the things I think that happens on DMT have a lot to do with what are the local geometric invariants of the different regions of your consciousness in such a way that different notions of energy become possible, and you can have kind of like an algebra of interactions between those different patches of your field. Okay, a lot of information, most of all just vibes. Let's figure this out for the benefit of all sentient beings. All right, thank you so much for tuning in. I'll talk to you on another topic another time. Ciao, infinite bliss.